As we've looked this week at our Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast at the return of Christ, starting first of all with his incarnation and his coming to earth, but he's coming again, and we've looked at some of the descriptions found in the Old Testament, in the words of Jesus, and in the book of Revelation, as well as the book of 1 Thessalonians about this. This is not something that just has a minor verse here or there. This is a big event. It's the blessed hope, the return of Jesus Christ. So how should we live in light of the return of Christ? We'll look at more of the details about the future later, but this week, I want to end this week with how should we live in the light of the return of Christ. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 24 once again, this time verse 44 about that. But before I do want to read kind of a summary of the differences between the first and second coming of Jesus Christ. But also not between the first and second coming, but between what we call the rapture and the actual coming to earth of Christ at the second coming. A friend of mine has written in about a summary that I think does very good justice to this. I'm just going to read what he says. This is in the Journal of Dispensational Theology. And he makes these distinctions between the rapture and what we might call the second coming, where Christ actually comes to earth. He says this: there are no signs prior to the rapture. There are signs preceding the return or the second coming. At the rapture, Christ comes for his saints. At the return, he comes with his saints. Christ meets Christians in the air at the rapture. Christ returns to the earth at the return. Unbelievers remain at the rapture. Unbelievers are taken at the return. That is, they are at that point in time, I think, that is when they are destroyed to challenge him. At the rapture, no changes occur on the earth. At the return, great changes occur on the earth. At the rapture, there is no mention of Satan. At the return, Satan is bound. After the rapture, the tribulation begins. After the return, the millennium or the kingdom age begins. That's a good summary, I think, of the differences between what we call the rapture and the actual second coming. Some might call that two stages of the second coming. That would be fine as long as you distinguish them between one another. There's a 7-year gap between the rapture and the taking of the saints and the coming of Christ on earth to set up his kingdom. But in the meanwhile, how should we be living? Well, Jesus gives us insight into that in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24, verse 44. He says, for this reason, after all he said about his return and so forth, for this reason, he says, you also must be ready. For the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. And so we're always called to be prepared for the return of Christ. As Christians, we're looking forward to the rapture. We have no signs given in the whole Bible preceding the rapture. We don't know when that's going to be. We have signs that precede the second coming, and sometimes we look at those and the current events of things happening in our world, and we see things lining up perhaps for the future return of Christ, but we can never be sure when that's going to be. And we certainly are not sure when the rapture is going to take place. And so we're told in Matthew, we're told in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and other places, we need to be ready. Our lives should be ready for the return of Christ. The fact that he is returning should not just be something that is curious to us, something that we're writing charts about or even theologically lining up all of our dots. But it's a time in which it calls us to want to prepare our hearts and lives so that we're living in light of his return. This is the great emphasis, I think, living in the light of the return of the Lord Jesus. Jesus gives sort of a parable, verse 45, who then is faithful and sensible slave, whom when his master put in charge of the household to give them their food at a proper time? Blessed is the slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if the evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour when he does not know, and to cut him to pieces and assign him to place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So there's two different responses here that Jesus talks about in light of his return. There's the evil slave who rejects Christ, and it ultimately shows up in how he lives his life. The fact that he rejects Christ, lives as a hypocrite, proves he's not a believer at all, and he will be assigned with those in hell. But the true follower of Christ, the faithful and sensible slave, will live his life in light of that return of Christ. And the Lord, and he will be blessed when the Master comes and finds him living in that way. So may you and I live that way. May this cause us to want to, the fact of his return cause us to want to live with all of our hearts for the Lord Jesus every moment of our lives. And as we get discouraged sometimes with the events around us, may we remember the Lord has a plan. He's coming again. May he find us faithful when he returns.